Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the third day of our annual Adam Smith Week, sponsored by the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Professor Peter Calcano. I'm the Director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process and a Professor of Economics here at the College of Charleston. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. We are halfway through the week, but there are still several exciting events left, so please review the schedule. You can find it at go.cfc.edu/ASW, and we'll post that into the chat so that you can find that. I encourage you also to find our webpage, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We are not alone in celebrating Adam Smith Week this year. By going virtually, we've had the ability to coordinate with 9 other centers and organizations that are joining us around the country and offering sponsorships and events. For tonight's speaker, I was given the privilege of first meeting Virginia Postrel through her brother, who actually used to work at the College of Charleston. I've been forever grateful for that introduction, and this is not the first time Virginia has spoken to us here at the College of Charleston, and in fact marks the 3rd time, but I believe the 1st time for Adam Smith Week. I'm excited to hear her talk today, which was recently voted number 5 on Econ Talks last year on this topic. I encourage you again to please check out our webpage, learn more about our programming for the center. I now want to introduce you to one of our market process scholars, Emily Cook, to introduce our speaker. Emily?
Hi, everyone. As Dr. Calcano said, I am a current market process scholar at the College of Charleston Center for Public Choice and Market Process, and I'm very excited to be introducing today's speaker, Virginia Postrel, who is a Los Angeles-based author, independent researcher, and columnist with a wide range of interests spanning from social sciences to fashion. Specifically, she likes to focus on how culture, technology, and business interact. Ms. Postrel graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Princeton University with a bachelor's in English literature, but also had a very heavy concentration on economics coursework. Ms. Postrel has been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Forbes, and currently contributes to Bloomberg Opinion. For nearly 11 years, she was the editor of Reason magazine, where her leadership brought them to the National Magazine Awards as a finalist. And she also founded the magazine's website, reason.com. Beyond her work in journalism, she's also the author of 3 books titled The Power of Glamour, The Substance of Style, and The Future and Its Enemies. With her 4th book, The Fabric of Civilization, How Textiles Made the World, is set to be available on November 10th. For her talk today, she will be giving us an insight to what her newest book is all about, discussing how textiles, one of humanity's first and most important technologies that often gets overlooked, actually have a fascinating history that has changed the world through innovation in technology, industry, and commerce. During her research for this new book, she actually learned how to weave and is now the program co-chair for the Southern California's Handweavers Guild. I am very excited to introduce her today, and I'm also very excited to hear her speak.
Thank you very much, Emily and Pete. It's always fun to be involved with the College of Charleston and its many friends around the country. So I'm going to share my screen. One correction to the introduction, which is entirely my fault because I guess I didn't update my website, is that it was last November that my book came out. So it is available. So buy it today. But first, I will tell you a little bit about it. And actually, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you a short video that gives you kind of an overview of the message of the book. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a few specific examples from the book. I'm Virginia Postrel, the author of The Fabric of Civilization. My book is about one of humanity's most important and influential technologies, textiles. The word textiles comes from the Indo-European root tex, which means to weave. It's the same root that gives us the word technology. Textiles are such an old technology that we rarely think about them. They hide in plain sight. From the moment we are born, we are surrounded by cloth. We sleep among textiles, walk on them, wash, and dry with them. Textiles protect us from the elements. They carry our stuff. They help us celebrate. Textiles are everywhere. Textiles go to war. They keep us safe. And bandage wounds. They provide comfort and joy. The story of textiles is older than history and younger than tomorrow. It stretches back to cave dwellers twisting plant fibers into string, and forward to scientists embedding threads with computer chips. It is the story of human ingenuity in all its manifestations, artistic and technical, economic and cultural. The pursuit of cloth gave us germ theory. It led to the belt drive and the chemical industry. It built factories and finance. Textile traders spread the alphabet and Arabic numbers, literacy and bookkeeping. They funded the Italian Renaissance and the Mughal Empire, the David and the Taj Mahal. The story of textiles is a story of commerce and culture, a story of peaceful trade and savage wars. The story of textiles is a human story. It's a story made by women and by men, by famous leaders and forgotten peasants. It's a story of art and science, of economics and religion. It's a global story set in every time and place. It is humanity's story. It is our story. Please join me in exploring the fabric of civilization, how textiles made the world. So the story of textiles starts with fiber. You can't have cloth unless you have something to make it out of. And that story starts with fiber. And one of the points that I make in the book that I think is very important is that although we talk about natural fibers today to distinguish them from synthetic fibers like nylon and polyester, in fact, all of the fibers we use are not natural. They are human artifacts. They took a lot of labor to get to where they are. And so what I want to do today is start with the most popular natural so-called fiber, and that is of course cotton. And we know what cotton looks like. It's these big white fluffy balls that all come out at once on these sort of waist-high bushes, and that's cotton. But that's not cotton. That's not cotton as it exists in the wild. Cotton as it exists in the wild looks more like this. This is me. I took this picture looking up at a cotton tree. And you can see a little strand of cotton hanging down here. And these are the cotton fibers around the seeds. And you looking up at that bowl, that thread, I thought, oh, this is the sensation that somebody had many thousands of years ago. They looked at that and they thought, I could do something with that. Now, I saw this cotton tree in the greenhouse in, of all places, Iowa State in Ames, Iowa, where this fellow, Jonathan Wendell, is one of the world's leading authorities on the genetics and the evolutionary history of cotton. And one thing that I learned from him is that there are many species of cotton, about 50, and he has most of them up in this greenhouse on top of his building at Iowa State. And most of those species, all but 4 of those species, have no more fiber on them than a peach. They have pretty flowers, look kind of like hibiscus, but they don't have any fiber. The mutation that produced the fiber happened only once. It happened on a plant in Africa that was the ancestor, the direct ancestor of this one. This is a wild version of that plant today. And you can see how small these flowers are, which gives you some idea of how small the bolls of cotton would be once the flowers went away and the bolls came out. But on this one species in somewhere in Africa, we don't know exactly where, but possibly around maybe Uganda, uh, there was a mutation that produced fiber. And human beings, when they came along, figured out how to do something with that fiber and bred cotton plants, developing 4 different domesticated species, 2 in the old world, 1 in Africa, as I say, probably around Uganda, 1 in the Indus Valley in northern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that area now, and 2 in the New World, 1 in the Yucatan and what is now Mexico, and 1 in Peru. And those New World cotton species are, in fact, what we mostly use today. The there is Gossypium hirsutum, which is 90% of all the cotton that's used today. It's those big fluffy bolls that I showed picture of at the beginning, and also the tree that I showed. And these developed on the Yucatan Peninsula, many thousands of years of human development, from this is what they look in the wild to this is the cultivated form. This is what developed in Peru. It's called Gossypium barbadense, and this is sometimes called Sea Island cotton. It was actually grown in the Charleston area. It was one of the few places in the U.S. it could grow, um, and it looks something like this in the wild. We don't have the exact wild version, but this is a version of a related plant. And then this is the old world version. This is what developed in India, and this is the wild version of that. So you can see that these big fluffy bowls with a lot of fiber for every seed and much whiter color are a human product. They developed from many, many generations of careful breeding. So long before we had this phrase of genetically modified organisms, genetically modified cotton, human beings had, without knowing anything about genetics, modified the cotton to make it useful for human purposes. Now, cotton or flax or insides of tree bark. There are lots of things you can make string out of, and string is a very valuable technology. It goes back 50,000 years to Neanderthals, actually. And once you have string, there are all kinds of things you can do. You can make fishing nets, you can make traps, you can attach spearheads to spears, you can make baby carriers, you can hang your food up above the ground so it doesn't rot or vermin don't get to it. Lots of things become possible when you have string. But it took many thousands of years to go from string, which is small quantities made by usually rubbing some plant fibers against your thigh, to large quantities, which we might call thread or yarn. And that's what you need to make cloth. You need large quantities, and to produce them, you need agriculture. So people started making thread and yarn in order to make cloth. And one thing that people don't understand is that it takes a lot of thread to make anything. So around the world, people developed some technologies for making long, strong bunches of thread. And you do this by twisting fibers together so that the friction works to hold them together, and you can add to it. So instead of having a little tiny cotton fiber or a slightly longer wool fiber of a few inches, you get many, many, many yards. And the technology that developed all around the world was something called the drop spindle. And here's a version of it on a Greek vase. It's basically a stick with a weight at one end, and you set the stick spinning and you feed the fiber onto it, and that works. And you can have the weight can be at the top or the bottom. They're different technologies, but this was developed all over the world. It was developed in Greece, as you can see. It was developed in different parts of Asia, Africa, the Americas. Everywhere around the world, people figured out that you could make you could make thread with a drop spindle. And later on, people figured out, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, that you could make it faster by using a big wheel to turn the little wheel. You have to turn the wheel on its side. And then in the 15th century, they added an attachment that gave us what we call the spinning wheel today. And that not only stretches out the thread and twists it, but also takes it up onto a reel. So I want to show you a couple of examples of what this looks like. And when you see them, you'll see why in many ancient mythologies, spinning was seen as a metaphor for life. It's sort of like it's almost like a magic thing. The birth of the thread, it seems to come up as if by magic and then to extend. So this is an Andean spinner and weaver from Peru who is using a drop spindle, and you can see the bundle of fiber, which is alpaca, is under her arm. This is a woman from Laos who is using what's called a spindle wheel. So this is that ancestor of the belt drive, where you use a big wheel to turn little wheel. And she is spinning cotton, which is harder to spin because it has much shorter fibers. So all around the world, people spun, and women in particular everywhere spun all the time. There was an English saying, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? And the idea was that Adam and Eve were condemned to labor for their daily bread, to labor for survival. And what does labor mean? Well, for men, it meant farming, digging, and for women, it meant spinning. This is sort of a medieval idea. And that was realistic because women were spinning all the time. They were spinning all the time. And the reason was quite simple, which is that you need a tremendous amount of thread to make anything. So let's consider a pair of blue jeans. To make the fabric, the denim for a pair of blue jeans requires 6 miles of thread. 6 miles of thread in a pair of blue jeans. And this is the 6-mile radius of the College of Charleston, to give you some idea of what 6 miles is. But 6 miles of thread. Now, that is a lot of thread for one pair of pants. And even more, that is a lot of time. It takes a long time to spin that much thread. And the result is that in the pre-industrial world, uh, any amount of cloth took an enormous amount of time to make, and a lot of that time was in the spinning. So to spin the thread for a single Viking sail took the equivalent of 385 8-hour days. And the result of that is, from start to finish, the sail took longer to create than the ship. You've got to shear or pluck the sheep, you've got to clean the wool, you've got to spin the wool, you've got to weave the wool, you got to attach those strips of wool, because each one of these is basically the width of one loom, into a whole sail. And all of that takes longer to create than even the ship, which, they weren't using chainsaws and power tools back then. So the ship itself was quite a laborious process. In the pre-industrial revolution world, any amount of cloth represented a tremendous amount of work, and a lot of that work was in simply making the thread. So, for example, those 6 miles in a pair of jeans, in the fastest kind of spinning that was available before the Industrial Revolution, which was the Indian charka, it would have taken 100 hours to make enough cotton thread to weave the denim in a pair of jeans. 100 hours. And that doesn't include preparing the cotton, ginning the cotton, making it clean, all of that. And it doesn't include weaving. That's just for the spinning. And with slower technologies, it took even longer. So you could see how even something as simple as a bed sheet represented months of labor just to produce the thread, and you still have to weave it and dye it if you want to dye it. So in up until the late 18th century, this is the world that human beings everywhere lived in. It was a world where thread was precious, cloth was precious, and women in particular spent all their time making thread. Any free moment they would spin. And even with that tremendous amount of production, with 20 people spinning for every person weaving, there was not enough thread. That sometimes the weavers would be sitting around twiddling their thumbs because they didn't have the supplies they need to make cloth. So this is a situation in the late 18th century when inventors in England start to figure out how to make spinning machines. And this, once you get spinning mills and spinning machines where a single person can be monitoring a whole bunch of bobbins at once, producing cloth, producing the thread, the yarn to make cloth goes from a process that takes days to a process that takes hours, minutes, and today it's even seconds. And this isn't just about clothes. Textiles are not just clothes. They're not just blankets and sheets. They're sails. They're bags, they're sacks for carrying produce, goods, all kinds of products. They're tents. There are various kinds of belts. There are many things that, particularly in the late 18th, 19th century, into the 20th century, before the invention of plastics, textiles are everywhere today. They were really everywhere then. So when you invent a technology that suddenly makes the ability to make textiles explode, it raises the standard of living for everyone. It makes clothes less expensive. It creates higher paid jobs. Not that these are high paid jobs by today's standards by any means, but compared to what women made spinning with hand spindles, these women in this spinning mill are making more money because they are more productive. So you requires enormous amounts of thread to make any kind of cloth, and it used to take enormous amounts of time to make that thread. So now you go from spinning to weaving or knitting. And the theme of my discussion, my chapter on cloth, is that cloth is embodied code. It is mathematical, whether it's knit or whether it's woven. Cloth is fundamentally mathematical in the same way that music is fundamentally mathematical. You may or may not be aware of the math that's going on, but it's there. Mathematics is the science of patterns, and patterns are everywhere in cloth. Here is an example. This is an Andean woven pattern, traditional pattern. And this illustrates the idea of symmetry, because the way Andean weavers invent, vary, remember patterns is by playing with symmetry. This middle stripe is actually this stripe, and its mirror image. All of that remembering what threads to lift to make that pattern comes from understanding those relations. And of course, weaving is the original binary operation. A thread is either up or down. You are either passing the weft thread, which is the one that goes from weft to right, left to right. It's either going over a warp thread, which are these that you can see here, or it's going under one. You've got 1, 0, on, off, up, down. It's a binary operation that is thousands of years old, and people have been creating, remembering and recording these binary patterns for many, many millennia. However, if you know one thing about textile history, you probably know this, and that is that Jean-Marie Jacquard was a French inventor and weaver in uh, the uh, early 19th century. He invented this loom attachment, and this used a punch cards, which had either there was either a hole or not a hole, and if there was a hole, the thread, the warp thread stayed put, and if there was not a hole, it lifted up, and you could make a pattern. You could even make this portrait. This is actually woven. It is not engraved. It took about 20,000 of these cards. Each card represents one thread going across here. And so once this invention was out there, weaving and weaving patterns in particular became much faster, more automated, and it also inspired people who were thinking about other types of binary processes that might be automated. So in the 19th century, it started to be used for things like welding on new ironclad ships. And then in the 20th century, people took some of the, well, in the 19th century, there were writings about it, but in the 20th century, people took direct inspiration, and this was used in early computers. And some of that inspiration, people didn't even realize they were being inspired by weaving. In the early computers, up until the invention of silicon chips in the 1970s, if you wanted to store a computer program, you did it on something like this. And this is what is called magnetic core memory. It's basically woven wires. You've got horizontal and vertical wires, and then a diagonal at the cross. And at each intersection, you've got a little magnetic disc, like a little donut, tiny, tiny, tiny. And you send a electrical impulse down the wire to a specific place, and it can change the polarization of that magnetic donut from positive to negative, 0 to 1. And this was how computers stored programs up until the 1970s, or data of whatever type. And the people who invented magnetic core memory, they weren't overtly thinking about weaving. They were just thinking about how to solve a problem. But the binary nature of weaving, the fundamental mathematics of weaving, led to this new technology. So we go from cloth to dye. And dye is interesting because it challenges our thinking about what cloth is for. Why do we have textiles? The first things that come to mind are we have textiles because we need them. We need protection from the elements. We need sacks to carry things in. We need blankets to keep us warm at night. All of this kind of thing. But dye challenges that functional limitation that says there's something else going on and it is old. So these are indigo. This is an indigo dyed textile found in a very dry part of Peru. It is 6,200 years old, and this is a computer rendition of the pattern. And what you have here, 6,200 years ago, somebody not only made cloth, they dyed some of the yarn blue. They made stripes. And in addition to the blue yarn and the naturally kind of tan yarn, which is from the cotton at that time, they also incorporated some milkweed fibers, which were a bright white. So they have this three-colored cotton cloth 6,200 years ago. 6,200 years ago, people were really poor. These are people who are living on the edge of survival. These are some of the first settlements of people, human beings anywhere. And they were creating this indigo dyed cotton textile. And the first thing this tells us is that people care about something other than function. They care about beauty what it looks like, the aesthetic appeal, and probably they also care about some kind of meaning. That could be, this is, I'm Virginia and I like to wear this color blue. It could be very personal. It could be a religious association. It could be a tribal association. It could be uh, boys wear blue and girls wear pink. We use textiles to show all different kinds of meaning, and we have done so for many, many years. The other thing it shows is that people are smart. Uh, the archaeologist who worked on these textiles has this wonderful quote: "In the modern world, we sometimes think of ancient people as primitive with a lack of understanding about the world, but really you had to be pretty smart to live back then." And it is true that ancient people were primitive. That is, they didn't have our understanding about the world. There were lots of things they didn't know. But there's a difference between having lots of things you don't know and being dumb. People were really smart. They were really smart to figure out how to dye with indigo, because dyeing with indigo is incredibly complicated. It is incredibly complicated. And the miracle is people all over the world figured it out. So here's a little, it's a quick tour of the indigo process. You have a vat of this dye, and it has these sort of blue bubbles on top, but it's kind of greenish underneath. And you dip cloth in, and the cloth turns green. When you take the cloth out, it's green. And then when you put it out in the sun, out in the air, the more it's exposed to the air, then it becomes blue. What's going on is incredibly complicated chemically. You're taking a plant, and all around the world, people use different plants. A plant that has a certain chemical in it and also has some enzymes. You put it in the water. The enzymes turn this chemical into this chemical. You can ignore this stuff here. And then it's exposed to oxygen and it creates the blue. But there's a problem. This blue is not a dye, it's a pigment. That is, it's solid. It won't go into the cloth. So in order to get it to go into the cloth, you got to take that, then you got to change it into another chemical, then you got to change that chemical into another chemical, then you put it into the air and it turns blue. Very complicated. Now, obviously, 6,200 years ago, people were not using these little chemical formulas. Dyeing shows us just how far you can get with trial and error experimentation without that fundamental understanding. And the amazing thing is that all around the world, people figured out indigo. They figured it out in India, hence the name. They used a plant that is the plant that is called indigo by English speakers. They figured it out in Europe, where the plant was called woad, different plant. They figured it out in Japan, yet another plant. They figured it out in West Africa, yet another plant. Indonesia, yet another plant. All around the world, there are other places as well. People figured out how to dye with indigo, which is the blue that is in your blue jeans. They didn't understand the chemistry of it. And this was true of dyes in general. Dyeing was more like cooking. It was a matter of following the recipes that you learned from your parents, or from, if you're an apprentice, from your master, uh, and following those and maybe experimenting with them a little bit. But it wasn't something where you understood the underlying chemistry of it. Only in the 17th century did people start to have this new science of chemistry and to start to think that maybe we could apply this to dyes. And in the 17th and 18th century, all around in Europe, people started trying to develop chemistry and apply it to dyes. Particularly in France, this is taken from the dye works in France, where the government sponsored research on dyes, and the best job was to be the inspector of the dyes, which sounds like just a bureaucrat with a clipboard checking on things, but actually was a big scientific post. And then in the 18th century, you start to actually get people understanding chemistry. And this fellow, Antoine Lavoisier, is sort of the father of modern chemistry, publishes his great treatise in 1789. And his wife was his lab assistant, who's also in the portrait. And this is the first time you have some very fundamental ideas about oxidation, about elements, and all of this sort of stuff, which the science of chemistry comes to be built on. And then in the 19th century, it finally pays off in dyes with this guy, William Perkin. Only he didn't look anything like this when he made his great discovery. He was, in fact, an 18-year-old student, a chemistry student, home on vacation for Easter, and he had a lab at his parents' house. And he was fooling around with trying to take some industrial waste that was called coal tar and turn it into a very valuable malaria drug called quinine. And people were trying to figure out ways to synthesize this drug because you could only make it in that time from a tropical plant, which was hard to get, and people wanted a lot more because malaria was, particularly in the tropics, very common. They needed this drug. And his experiment was a complete flop, didn't get the quinine at all, but he noticed when he dissolved this stuff in alcohol that it turned this beautiful purple. And living in Great Britain in the 19th century, where the textile industry was a huge industry, he had the kind of thought that somebody today who maybe was fooling around with software or something might have, which is, hey, I could start a dye company. I could start a company. I could make a lot of money if I could start a dye company. And he did some research, talked to somebody who was in the business, and the guy said, yes, absolutely. We don't, this purple is having a kind of fashion moment now, but we don't have any good dyes to make it. They all fade really quickly. So if you came up with something that could solve that problem, it would be a big hit. So he did start a company, and like many entrepreneurs before or since, many people I've talked to over the course of my career, if he'd had any idea how hard it was going to be, he never would have done it because it was incredibly hard. Basically, he had to invent the chemical industry. In order to take this experiment, which worked great on a lab bench, and scale it up so you'd have lots and lots of dye for lots and lots of textiles, he had to invent whole new apparatuses, machines, not only to produce the dye, but to produce the chemicals to produce the dye. And this was the birth of the modern chemistry. In the chemical industry, he was successful. The dye was a huge hit. It came to be called mauve, and other scientists went on to create different dyes. And over the course of several decades in the 19th century, suddenly there was an explosion of all these brilliant colors and all these dyes, so many dyes that people couldn't even come up with names. It was tricky. And one of the things that this explosion of colors led to is this dress. This is a dress from 1860. It's in the collection of the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology. And I saw this dress many years ago, probably about 15 years ago, in an exhibit on the history of color in fashion. And when I saw this dress, I got it. I understood why synthetic dyes, sometimes called aniline dyes, were so revolutionary, why they were so popular, because the purple on this dress is so intense and the black is so intense. And you don't see colors like that in earlier eras. These intense colors are made possible, and especially made possible at prices the average person can afford, by the invention of synthetic dyes. And then the synthetic dyes make possible chemical companies like Bayer, which is more famous for its aspirin, which was a product that was an offshoot of its dye works. You get drugs, you get explosives, you get adhesives, glues, paints, you get film, photographic chemicals. So all of the photographic industry and the film industry come out of the chemical industry that starts with dyes. And then in the 20th century, you get synthetic fibers and plastics. And it all starts with dyes. Now, throughout this talk, there has been an implicit theme about blue jeans, hence the background. And so I wanted to mention Adolf Baer, who, again, was a lot younger when he made his great discovery synthesizing indigo. This picture is from 1905 when he won the Nobel Prize for that and other chemical research. But he figured out how to make indigo in the lab and therefore at an industrial scale, with instead of grinding up plants. And there's still some made from grinding up plants, but it's much easier to make it and cheaper to make it this way. And so we now live in a world where people invent new machines, computer driven, to take the indigo off your stuff. So one of the themes of the fabric of civilization is that we suffer textile amnesia because we enjoy textile abundance. The abundance of textiles we enjoy is wonderful, but I think it is worth looking at where they came from. And I'm glad to have been able to share just a little bit of that textile history with you today. Thank you.